Daenerys stood on the ramparts of the Red Keep, the wind off Blackwater Bay tousling her silver-gold hair. She no longer wore her braids, for she had claimed her throne and broken the chains of countless thousands. Now, she had broken the Iron Throne itself, melted beneath the furious breath of Drogon in front of a disbelieving crowd that had gathered in the ashes of King's Landing. Weeks had passed since that world-shattering moment, and still the charred remains of the twisted throne lay at the foot of the Great Hall, a silent testament to her new decree. No more kings, no more lords, no more ladies. The only title, she had declared, that truly mattered was that of a living, breathing human being, a child of the realm with equal claim to love and justice, to safety and dignity. Yet the aftershock of such a sweeping change could not be understated. She walked the ramparts alone, thinking of how the bells had tolled, how the city had burned, how her advisors had recoiled at the extremes of her anger. Most had stayed only because they believed in her dream of a better world, a dream that might, in the end, redeem the fire and blood she had unleashed. Tyrion Lannister had once told her, in a voice quavering between awe and doubt, that she had a chance to do what no one had done in all the millennia of Westerosi history. She had the chance to build a new order free from the stranglehold of hereditary power. It began with her announcement at dawn, "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. But to you, I am Daenerys, Mother of Dragons, your ally and your servant. I will not bear the title of queen. I do not need it. All I need is the loyalty of free men and free women who choose to stand with me and build a realm of equals." In that sunlit moment, huddled crowds in the half-ruined streets looked on in confusion. Some knelt out of habit or fear, others did not, and she did not command it. Instead, she ordered her soldiers to stow their weapons. She sent Grey Worm to oversee the clearing of rubble and the creation of food lines. Tyrion was sent to calm the small folk with a gentle, witty speech, for even in the midst of sorrow, humor could ease hearts. The days turned into a blur of changes. The Ravenry at the Red Keep was set to overtime, sending messages throughout the throughout all the corners of Westeros. Letters proclaiming the immediate abolition of all noble titles. House words, house sigils, the intangible legacy of might and blood, would mean nothing in the new order. The shock rippled outward. Some of the old lords, scattered or hidden away, must have read her words in numb astonishment. Others must have scoffed, calling it a hoax. But Daenerys's dragons were no hoax, and the Unburnt herself was no rumor. She had survived betrayals and wars, toppled tyrants, crossed deserts and seas. If she wished to end the feudal system, who would stand to stop her? Westeros, Daenerys realized, was not just 7 kingdoms forcibly united by Aegon the Conqueror's dragons. It was a continent of deep and ancient loyalties. Many small folk still believed in the Lord who protected them, or at least in the idea of it. Not all lords had been cruel, after all. And what of Sansa Stark in the north or Gendry Baratheon? Raised to Lord of Storm's End by Daenerys' own decree before the last great battle, how would they react? She remembered the look on Gendry's face when he had first tasted the idea of nobility. He had been stunned, but proud, as though he finally belonged somewhere. Now that belonging was stripped away. On that first morning of the new decree, Daenerys had half expected a silent rebellion to start. She fully anticipated that the lords who had survived her conquest might band together in bitterness. Instead, nothing happened immediately. It was as though the realm was simply too exhausted by the wars. The War of the Five Kings, the war against the dead, and finally the last war for the throne. Everyone was tired. They needed time to catch their breath. They needed to see if her words were real or simply a new brand of tyranny. So the city worked and waited, many bracing for the worst while daring to hope for something better. Daenerys believed she needed to mend the wounds she had inflicted when her dragon's fire had rained on King's Landing. She had not wished to kill innocents, but fury and heartbreak, and the taste of betrayal from her closest companions, had clouded her mind. Now, each day, she visited the charred neighborhoods, distributing bread, ensuring the laborers and stonemasons were paid with coin from the Targaryen treasury. She told them to rebuild not for a queen but for themselves. "Westeros belongs to you," she said. Its fields, its roads, its destiny. No one shall claim them from you again. Some listened with tears in their eyes, some with quiet disbelief. Word spread that even the mightiest houses had lost their ancient claims. House Greyjoy, House Arryn, House Tyrell, now nearly extinct. House Tully, House Frey. Names once formidable now rang only as echoes of the old world. Some among the small folk whispered that all this was merely a trick. Some among the ex-lords fumed in private. Still, open defiance did not come swiftly. Daenerys had Drogon. She had the Unsullied. She had a frightened population that, for better or worse, preferred her uncertain promise to the known cruelty of war. Yet it was never going to be simple. One evening in the privacy of a once grand solarium, Tyrion found Daenerys gazing at the mosaic floor, her eyes distant. A glimmer of moonlight illuminated her face. He asked her if she was truly sure she wanted to discard every form of noble governance. He reminded her that a realm the size of Westeros needed structure, needed leadership. Daenerys, in a tired voice, told him that she had not destroyed the Great Will just to start it turning again under a different name. The lords would be replaced with councils. Men and women chosen by their own communities, not by blood. "We will find a way," she said, her voice unwavering, though her eyes glimmered with an undercurrent of doubt. The next weeks saw the forging of these councils. Messengers rode out to every major region: Dorne, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Vale, the Iron Islands, the North. These outriders carried invitations rather than commands, for Daenerys insisted that the new system be shaped by the will of the people. The call was clear: send delegates chosen by the inhabitants of your region to King's Landing. They will help build the realm's new charter. The first challenge came from the Iron Islands. Yara Greyjoy, one of the few living heirs of a prominent house, had sworn fealty to Daenerys in the name of independence from the crown. Now the crown itself was dissolved in all but name, replaced by some mysterious concept of equal rule. Yara arrived by ship soon after. She climbed the steps of the Red Keep, still bearing the old Greyjoy sigil on her leathers. Tyrion half expected Daenerys to forbid such heraldry, but the Targaryen queen only nodded in welcome, observing that Yara's house was part of history, not a rightful brand of dominion. Yara, for her part, was blunt. She wanted to know if her people would, under this new order, still be subjugated by the rest of Westeros. Daenerys responded that nobody would be subjugated anymore. Not the Ironborn, not the Reachmen, not the Riverlanders. You can follow your ways, provided they do not harm others, she said. Westeros can unite in trade and defense, but we will not hold you in chains. We are forging a realm of equals. Yara had laughed at that. We'll see, she said. The Iron Islands don't often trust sweet words, no matter who speaks them. Still, she lingered in King's Landing, curious, perhaps even hopeful, about how this might unfold. Then came delegates from the north. Their arrival was complicated by a simple, painful truth. Many in the north did not trust Daenerys after the burning of King's Landing and the rumors of betrayal that surrounded the death of Varys. Sansa Stark, though reluctant, traveled south with a small retinue. She was no longer Lady of Winterfell, at least not in the official sense, for that title no longer existed. But she remained a leader in spirit, loved and trusted by the northern folk. When she arrived, Daenerys greeted her courteously, addressing her only as Sansa. They spoke in hushed voices. Tension was thick as winter clouds. "How do you intend to keep the realm unified if every old house resents you?" Sansa asked. "If the Targaryen name once made men kneel in fear, now you're telling them to stand on equal ground. I admire the principle, but I question the practicality." Daenerys let out a slow breath. "If they resent me for taking away their hereditary power, I can endure that resentment. If they doubt me, let them. I will prove myself with action. It is not me they need to place faith in. It is the promise that no child will ever starve because a lord locked away the harvest, or that no peasant will die for a war started over petty feuds between houses." Sansa said nothing, but in her cool blue eyes, there was at least the spark of reason, perhaps even an ember of agreement. She had grown weary of the old ways long ago. Word also arrived from the Vale. Little Lord Robin, who had grown older but none the wiser, insisted he was the rightful ruler of the Vale, yet with no official recognition of Lord Paramount. He found himself overshadowed by a group of knights and stewards who had formed their own council to represent the Vale's interests. Their letters indicated cautious support of the new system, mostly because the Vale had been spared the worst of the final war and saw the potential benefits of a realm at peace. Robin, rumored to be sulking in the Eyrie, was eventually persuaded by his advisors to at least send delegates. Not that he had much choice. From the Riverlands came a ragtag assembly, for the region had been torn apart repeatedly by conflicts, and many once proud houses, Tully, Fry, etc., were reduced to near ruin. Common folk, blacksmiths, village elders, they stepped forward, uncertain but determined to have a voice. The Freedmen's Council, as they called themselves, carried letters describing how the once despised House Fry had fractured after the collapse at the Twins, and that the Tullys, scattered and overshadowed by more immediate concerns, had little claim left. The Freedmen's Council saw in Daenerys' decree a chance to finally be rid of the feudal bullies. Within King's Landing itself, the changes started small. City watchmen no longer swore fealty to a king or queen. They swore an oath to protect the people. The leftover gold cloaks, the new volunteers, and former soldiers of the Lannister armies all found themselves under the same code, wearing uniforms that, at Daenerys' insistence, displayed no lion, no stag, no dragon. Some grumbled. The old ways died hard. But slowly, a new sense of identity began to form, an identity tied to the city itself, not to a highborn family. Yet there was friction. There were pockets of violence in the outer wards, roving gangs formed of disillusioned soldiers who had lost their cause. There were rumors of conspiracies in the hills to the north, of small gatherings of ex-lords or knights who refused to give up their ancient privileges. Daenerys refused to send out Drogon in fury to burn them. She wanted no more scorched earth. But Grey Worm, still struggling with his own anguish over Missandei's death, pressed her for permission to march. He wanted to stomp out rebellion before it could gather real strength. Daenerys denied him. "I will not rule by fear," she told him one evening as they stood on a balcony overlooking the city. "That was the old way. We must live by this new ideal if we expect anyone else to do the same." Grey Worm's dark eyes glinted with pain. "Missandei believed in you," he said. "She believed you would break the chains of the world. If there is a threat, we must defend you. And the people." Daenerys nodded gently, a sadness in her expression. "We will defend them, but not with preemptive terror. That is no defense at all. That is tyranny." Wearing a new mask, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Help me build something better." Slowly, Grey Worm gave a curt, somber nod. The next day saw the arrival of a large contingent from the Reach. After the loss of Highgarden to the Lannisters, and with House Tyrell nearly extinct, the farmland and vineyards of the Reach were left largely to stewards, knights, and smaller landholders. They grumbled about giving up their status, but most were not directly connected to proud, ancient lines, House Hightower, House Redwine, House Oakhart, so they found it easier to adapt than might be expected. The delegates from the Reach carried baskets of fresh produce, as though to underline their region's value in feeding the rest of Westeros. They demanded fair trade and representation. They demanded that Daenerys not punish them for the support many had given Cersei Lannister. Daenerys promised them neutrality and fairness, and in exchange asked that they help feed the hungry in King's Landing. The bargain was struck swiftly. Then came word from Dorne, the land that had defied the Targaryens long ago. Dorne had always felt itself separate from the rest, and it had carried a fierce pride. With the death of Prince Doran Martell and then Prince Trystane, the line of Martells was believed extinct, though rumors of bastard lines and distant cousins persisted. The lords and ladies of Dorne were uncertain how to respond to Daenerys' edict. Many thought that, if no one could be a lord or lady, then there was nothing to stop Dorne from ignoring the rest of Westeros entirely. But the new Freedmen's Council beckoned them to join. Dorne had staved off conquest once, but it had also endured tragedy and isolation. The delegates who arrived to parley with Daenerys wore bright silks under the scorching sun outside the Red Keep. Their spokesman said only, We will hear your terms, breaker of chains, and see if your talk of equality rings true. All the while, King's Landing was slowly being rebuilt. The rubble from the sack was cleared, charred beams removed. Daenerys directed that new houses be constructed of limestone brought up from quarries near Rosby. She authorized payment for tradesmen, carpenters, masons. She insisted on employing local labor, no more enslaved labor, no more forced drafting of peasants. This new system required coin, which came partly from the Targaryen treasury and partly from confiscated Lannister gold. Tyrion oversaw the finances, ensuring that at least some measure of accountability existed. It was an enormous task, but he thrived on the challenge, even as he brooded over the cost and blood that had preceded it. Jaime Lannister had died outside the city's walls, no grave to mark his name. Cersei's bones lay somewhere beneath the collapsed floors of the Red Keep. Tyrion felt the weight of it every time he passed a certain corridor. But he told himself that an age had ended, and another was forming. He might play a part in shaping it for better or for worse. At last, a sprawling assembly of representatives gathered in what had once been the throne room. The Iron Throne, twisted and melted, remained where Drogon had left it, a scorched metal ruin. Daenerys insisted it remain there as a symbol of what had been destroyed. She stood before it, flanked by Tyrion and Grey Worm, while the delegates of every region arrayed themselves in a half-circle. Sansa stood among the Northerners, Yara among the Ironborn, and so forth. The watchers in the gallery included common folk from King's Landing, each of them curious and nervous. This was history, though no one quite knew what shape it would take. The discussion began. There was no set protocol, for Daenerys had not imposed one. Instead, each region's representatives aired their grievances, their hopes, their questions. The Freedmen's Council from the Riverlands demanded that farmland be distributed to those who actually worked it, not to absentee noble families. The people of the Vale insisted on safe roads for trade, and some demanded an end to the dreaded practice of forcibly taking children as wards. The Ironborn argued for the right to sail freely and raid foreign coasts if they so chose, prompting immediate objections from Tyrion, who pointed out that raiding foreign coasts was not exactly an act of equality or peace. Yara bristled, but eventually conceded that the old reaving ways might have to adapt, lest they provoke endless wars. Sansa expressed concern that the North would be forced to pay for southern rebuilding while her own people froze. Daenerys swore to maintain a balanced approach to the harvests and trade goods. Days stretched into weeks as they hammered out the framework of what they tentatively called the Freedmen's Charter. Daenerys was often silent in these sessions, letting Tyrion or Davos Seaworth, who had also come south to show support, speak. She wanted the delegates to negotiate among themselves without undue intimidation from her. Yet whenever a stalemate arose, she stepped forward with quiet authority, reminding them that if they clung too hard to their old grudges, they might as well resurrect the Iron Throne and let the dragons decide everything with fire. That stark reminder kept negotiations moving. Slowly, they formed a plan. Each region would form a local council, selected by the free men and women living there. That council, in turn, would send a smaller delegation to a grand council in King's Landing. That body, whose name was not yet decided, would handle realm-wide matters such as defense, trade, roads, and justice for interregional disputes. All formal titles, Lord Paramount, Warden of the North, Lady of Winterfell, Lady of the Vale, were dissolved. People would be addressed by their names alone, or by roles they held: steward, captain, blacksmith. Certain old traditions might be preserved ceremonially, if the local communities desired, but they would hold no legal power. When the concept was put forward, there were many doubters. Some from the north believed that an assembly of peasants would never reach quick decisions, and that they'd be better off independent. Some from the Riverlands worried that unscrupulous ex-lords would manipulate the councils to seize power anyway. And in secret corners, conspiracies brewed. Men who had once been lords or knights whispered among themselves that Daenerys had gone mad with power, ironically in the name of abolishing it. They saw her as a foreign conqueror dismantling centuries of tradition. They considered revolt A rumor reached Tyrion's ears that a group calling itself the Golden Steed was gathering men in the Westerlands, determined to restore the old ways by any means. When he mentioned it to Daenerys, she only said, "We'll keep watch. We will not strike first, but we will be ready." Tyrion nodded, feeling a flicker of unease. He still remembered her face as she rode Drogon over a burning city. He wanted to believe in this vision she now championed, but he also knew how fine the line was between righteous fury and violent tyranny. Despite the tensions, the Freedmen's Charter continued to take shape. The assembly squabbled over details: how to choose representatives, how to tax the populace for the realm's needs, how to maintain a standing force for defense without turning that force into a new Lannister army or a new Targaryen army. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Each regional council would provide volunteers for a realm-wide guard, a professional force trained to uphold law and protect against external threats. The volunteers would be rotated periodically, so no single Guion's forces dominated. They would carry the banner of a united Westeros, now simply a stylized map of the continent on a gray field. No stags, no lions, no dragons. The next question was who would command this new realm guard. All eyes turned to Grey Worm. He was commander of the Unsullied, the most disciplined soldiers in the world, loyal to Daenerys. Yet Daenerys surprised everyone by saying that Grey Worm would not be the sole commander. Instead, there would be a council of captains, each one chosen by the Freedmen's Charter. She looked at Grey Worm and said softly, "If you are willing, you can be among them, but only if they elect you. No more taking commands from a single ruler." Grey Worm's expression was unreadable. For him, structure and loyalty were sacred. But Missandei had believed in this dream. So he accepted, albeit with a certain melancholy. Time passed. New roads were planned, connecting the capital to the outlying towns. Diplomatic efforts began to address possible trade with Essos. Some of the exiled sellswords in the region posed a threat, so the new Realm Guard had to quell them in skirmishes outside Maidenpool. Nobody called it a war, for Daenerys insisted that wars were the very thing she was trying to end. Yet blood was shed, men died, and the new Freedmen's Council discovered how difficult it was to maintain a purely peaceful approach when faced with armed resistance from pockets of the old regime. Daenerys was forced to watch these developments with a heavy heart, sometimes wondering if the cost of her revolution would be too high. But she knew that forging a new order would not be painless. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast King's Landing in a dusky glow, Daenerys stood upon the debris-strewn courtyard where the dragon pit once stood. Drogon lay curled behind her. She stroked his scales, feeling the heat of his breath. He had grown restless in the city, often flying away to hunt in the countryside. But always he returned. She thought of her lost dragons, Regal, Viserion, and the wars they had fought. Her eyes drifted across the battered skyline, the scaffolding around half-collapsed towers, the flicker of torches among the working crews. A city in flux just like the realm. Footsteps approached. She turned to see Jon Snow. He was not Jon Snow, king in the north anymore. He was simply Jon, though many in the north still viewed him as a leader. He had chosen, oddly, to remain in King's Landing after the war, torn between loyalty to his family in the north and some lingering sense of responsibility to Daenerys. Their relationship was forever changed by the revelations of his lineage and by the devastation that had accompanied the city's fall. He had spoken out against the killing. He had nearly plunged a dagger into her heart in that fateful moment. But in the end, he had stayed his hand, believing there could be a path to redemption. Now he stood behind her, silent, watchful. She glanced at him. "Jon," she said quietly, acknowledging his presence but unsure of what else to say. Ever since she had shattered the throne, their conversations had been guarded, lacking the easy warmth they once shared. He nodded. "The city's starting to mend," he offered. People are calling it the Freedmen's City." A shadow of a smile touched her lips. A grand title for something still half-broken. Jon eyed Drogon's mighty bulk, remembering the roar of flames that had engulfed King's Landing. He folded his arms. "I always believed in breaking the wheel," he said. "I just never realized how that would look." Sometimes I don't know if this is what we fought for, or if it's just another dream that will collapse under the weight of reality." She studied him for a moment, her expression pensive. "Maybe it will. Maybe in 100 years, someone will find a way to twist it all back into a throne. But maybe not. Maybe we can give the realm a chance to breathe free for once." He sighed. "I spent my life among the Night's Watch, then among the wildlings, then as king in the north. Each time I tried to do what was right, but the world has a way of punishing us for trying to do right." "I know," she said softly. Her voice carried the memory of betrayal, of the losses she had endured. "But if we let fear stop us, we'll never change anything." They stood there in a fragile silence before Jon finally said he needed to depart for a meeting with some ex-rangers from the Wall who had traveled south. He left, his footsteps echoing on the cracked stones. Daenerys turned back to Drogon, pressing her cheek against his scales, lost in thought. Several nights later, the conspirators made their move. A band of masked figures, calling themselves the Golden Steed, slipped into King's Landing. They ambushed members of the Freedmen's Council on their way to a late session, leaving 2 delegates dead in a side alley, throats slashed. Word spread panic through the city. The rumor was that they aimed to assassinate Daenerys herself and declare a restoration of noble rule. The City Watch scrambled to respond, and Grey Worm mobilized a contingent of the Unsullied, placing them on high alert. It was Tyrion who found Daenerys in the old council chambers, poring over the Freedmen's Charter by candlelight. He told her of the murders, his voice trembling with subdued rage. She stood abruptly, fury stirring in her eyes. He could practically see the old dragon wrath rising. "How many must die for the illusions of these men?" she demanded, her fists curling. "They cling to the scraps of a broken system as though it were their mother's milk." Tyrion measured his next words carefully. "We must be decisive but not monstrous," he said. "We cannot burn the city again. If we do, everything we've tried to build will go up in flames." Her face hardened. "I know," she said, voice low, "but we cannot let them terrorize the people. We cannot be passive." They ordered the City Watch and the New Realm Guard to sweep the streets for suspicious gatherings. Over the next few days, they unearthed a nest of conspirators holed up in the ruins of a once noble mansion. 12 men were taken alive, discovered with weapons, forged documents of false claims to ancient titles, and a stash of gold they had stolen from old vaults in the city. The Freedmen's Council demanded justice. Now came the test of the new order: how to punish those who violently opposed it. A tribunal was convened, made up not of Daenerys' loyalists alone, but of representatives from the Freedmen's Council, the City Watch, and neutral observers. The conspirators were brought before them, heads bowed, hands bound. Some among them spat curses, calling Daenerys a tyrant and a foreign usurper. Others pleaded for mercy, claiming they were misled. The tribunal debated for hours, culminating in a unanimous verdict. Those who had murdered would pay with their lives. Those who had simply conspired would face labor for the rebuilding efforts. Daenerys looked on from her seat, her expression grim. The death sentence would be carried out not by dragonfire, but by the will of a realm that sought to enforce laws equally on all. And so, in the courtyard where countless executions and cruelties had taken place under various rulers, the Freedmen's Council oversaw the sentencing. Several men were hanged at dawn. The rest were dispatched to help rebuild the city's outer walls under guard, to be fed and housed but to labor until their debt was paid. Daenerys, watching from a balcony, felt both relief and sorrow. Death had not been averted, but neither was it her unilateral command. The Freedmen's Council had made the choice, forging a new path for justice. It was a small yet significant sign that the realm might indeed be able to govern itself without a single tyrant on the throne. Still, Daenerys was no mere bystander to these events. She remained a central figure, a powerful presence with an army and a dragon at her call. The ex-lords who stayed in the city did so under watchful eyes, some harboring resentment, some slowly coming to accept that times had changed. Tyrion devoted his time to shaping the finances of this new realm, ensuring that the gold from the Lannister vaults, as well as the crown's old treasury, was used to invest in roads, farmland, and the harbor. Davos oversaw the shipping lanes, hoping to revive trade so the city could feed itself and open new channels of commerce. Yara Greyjoy left for the Iron Islands after forging a tenuous understanding with the Freedmen's Council. The Ironborn would maintain their distinct culture but refrain from all reaving of Westerosi shores. In turn, they would enjoy free trade and a seat on the Grand Council. She parted with a curt nod to Daenerys, still skeptical but not wholly dismissive. Sansa Stark, too, announced her intention to return north, where the cold winds would soon blow. She promised to organize a Northern Council that would work cooperatively with the Freedmen's Charter, though she insisted on a certain autonomy. She spoke plainly to Daenerys. "I don't do this for you or because I've forgotten what you did to King's Landing. I do it because I see that if we don't try, we'll never have peace." Daenerys accepted her words with measured calm, acknowledging that trust was not easily rebuilt. The city's small folk, meanwhile, went about their lives. Some found new opportunities as the Freedmen's Council expanded the workforce. Many found themselves with access to the Red Keep's once private gardens for the first time, used now as communal growing spaces. Street vendors sprang up again, and though the city would bear the scars of war for decades, there was a new energy in the air. The knowledge that, theoretically, anyone could rise to speak in the local assemblies if they could rally enough of their neighbors. That was a novel power. Of course, not everyone was enthusiastic. Some muttered that life under a monarchy was at least predictable. Others feared that if the Freedmen's Council kept handing out land and coin, eventually it would run out, or the realm would break apart from internal disputes. Far to the west, in the hills of the Westerlands, the disaffected heirs of minor Lannister branches were said to be gathering forces. And in the far north, beyond the Gift, wildlings roamed without a single lord to rein them in. Could this lead to conflicts with northern farmers? The Freedmen's Council faced all these uncertainties daily, but Daenerys kept on, determined. She visited the new assemblies, giving speeches about unity and freedom, though these were more measured than her earlier proclamations of liberating the world. She sensed the caution in the crowds, the worry that her words might be a mask. She tried to let her actions speak louder. She funded orphanages, set up a system of traveling magistrates to hear disputes, and championed the idea that no woman in Westeros should be forced into a marriage for political gain. This last point caused upheaval among the older families, but it resonated with many younger folks who had seen too many forced betrothals tear families apart. As time marched on, the Freedmen's Charter was finalized. Its text was written on fine parchment, illuminated by skilled scribes, but also posted on public walls so commoners could read or hear it read aloud. It declared that all individuals in Westeros are free and equal under the law. All hereditary titles are abolished. No one shall rule by right of blood alone. Each region shall form a local council through a process of community selection. A Grand Council composed of regional delegates shall handle realm-wide matters. A Realm Guard, composed of volunteers from all regions, shall protect the realm. No region may secede from the Freedmen's Charter without a Grand Council vote. Justice shall be administered by tribunals representing the local and Grand Councils, ensuring neutrality. These principles were revolutionary for Westeros. Word spread across the narrow sea to Essos. Some envoys came from Pentos, Volantis, and Bravos, curious about what was happening in the once feudal land of dragons and kings. Many suspected chaos would follow. Others wondered if Westeros might become a power unlike any other, united not by a tyrant but by a shared belief. Daenerys remained at the heart of it, though she never again wore a crown. She refused the pleas of many that she remain in some official capacity, like Protector of the Realm or Consul or any similar title. She insisted the Freedmen's Council needed to stand on its own, without an omnipresent figure overshadowing it. Still, she accepted a lesser role, advisor on matters of foreign policy and dragons. The Freedmen's Council deemed it wise to keep on her good side and harness her influence, especially since Drogon still cast a long shadow in the skies. In the months that followed, small elections took place in city squares, in village greens, in the courtyards of old castles now repurposed as meeting halls. People tentatively cast votes by raising hands or placing stones in jars, rudimentary, but it was a start. Illiterate peasants stood side by side with once noble scions, forced to make their case publicly if they wanted a seat on the local council. Tales of bribery and intimidation were not uncommon, but the Freedmen's Council tried to root out the worst of it. Over time, scrappy new leaders emerged, some idealistic, some cunning, but all lacking the inherited pomp of old. Amid all this, Daenerys found a strange sense of calm. She would walk through the gardens of the Red Keep, now partially open to the public, and see children laughing among the roses. She would descend to the streets and find people from the lowest rungs of society, at least willing to speak up if they felt wronged. She saw new friendships forming between those who once would have been divided by feudal loyalties. That was the dream, the broken wheel. Yet every so often, she also heard of troubles. A band of raiders refusing to submit to the Freedmen's Charter, or a local strongman setting himself up as a petty tyrant in some distant village. Each time, the Freedmen's Council had to dispatch the Realm Guard. Sometimes it went well, sometimes it led to bloodshed. Daenerys would pace on the Red Keep's balconies, remembering how many times she had tried to free people only to see new oppressors spring up like weeds. She steeled herself, deciding that no matter how imperfect this new system was, she would nurture it. She refused to let cynicism become the last victor. Winter approached, though not as fiercely as the dire predictions once suggested. With the White Walkers defeated before the final war for the throne, the long night never fully descended on Westeros. Still, the roads grew icy in the north, and harvests needed storing in the Reach. The Freedmen's Council, for the first time in history, coordinated a realm-wide distribution of surplus grain, forging deals that ensured none would starve if regional harvests failed. It was not perfect. Some shipments were lost to bandits. Some local councils argued about who deserved how much, but it was an unprecedented effort at cooperation. In the north, Sansa presided over a local assembly in Winterfell's Great Hall, no longer the seat of House Stark but now a communal meeting place. She wrote letters to Daenerys describing the slow acceptance of the Freedmen's Charter. "The Northerners are proud," she wrote, "but they were always proud. At least now they argue with each other in open assembly rather than behind castle walls. It may be the lesser evil." Daenerys read these letters with cautious optimism. Perhaps, in time, Sansa would come to see that the burning of King's Landing, while unforgivable in many eyes, had led to a wave of reforms that might spare countless lives from future wars. Jon, meanwhile, spent more time wandering. Sometimes he traveled north to visit the free folk. He had been changed by the war, by the revelations of his parentage, by the knowledge that in another life, he might have been the rightful king. Now that it was all moot, he carried a sense of relief mixed with sorrow. He never took a seat on any council, never claimed any leadership role, but the Freedmen's Council recognized his skill as a mediator. Occasionally, they asked him to help settle disputes near the Gift, or to help manage the watch on the remainders of the wall. He did so quietly, never seeking glory. One day, Daenerys saw him in the courtyard of the Red Keep, brushing down a horse he intended to ride north. She approached and asked him if he was well. He shrugged in that solemn way of his, saying, "I'm better than I was. The realm seems better too." She nodded, thankful for the small exchange. She felt that a gulf still existed between them, but time had soothed the worst of their wounds. Meanwhile, Tyrion spent his days in near-constant negotiation, drafting trade agreements and conferring with envoys from Bravos, who viewed this newly minted realm with a mixture of amusement and wariness. He replaced his cups of wine with cups of goat's milk more often than not, as he needed a clear head. Davos joked that Tyrion was the realm's de facto master of coin, a title that no longer officially existed. Tyrion would sigh and say, "I prefer to think of myself as the realm's favorite clerk." In the gloom of a late autumn evening, Daenerys and her closest companions, Tyrion, Davos, and Grey Worm, shared a modest meal in what had once been the council chamber. A single unassuming table, a flickering candelabra, no grand feast. They spoke of the Freedmen's Charter, of the new Realm Guard, of continuing pockets of resistance. There was a moment of quiet reflection, each of them feeling the exhaustion of building a new world. Davos raised his cup. "To the Freedmen's Charter," he said in that low, gravelly voice. "And to peace." They drank. Tyrion quipped, "I believe this is the first time in centuries that a toasting of peace might actually be more than an empty gesture." Grey Worm, not one for many words, nodded stiffly. "We fight to protect the freedmen, not for lords." "That is good," he said, his accent still betraying the faraway Essos origins. Daenerys said little. In her heart, she felt the ghosts of her past. Her father's madness, her brother's cruelty, the wars she waged, and the mother she never knew. She pictured Missandei's bright smile, Khal Drogo's fierce grin, Ser Yora's loyal gaze, all of them gone. She remembered how she had once walked into a pyre with dragon eggs, emerging as the mother of dragons. Now she was mother to a new realm, desperately trying to nurture its fragile flame of freedom. At length, she softly said, "It isn't perfect, it never will be, but it's a start." They all understood. Indeed, it was only the beginning. For every improvement, new challenges rose. For every local council that functioned well, another might be plagued by corruption. For every region that embraced the Freedmen's Charter, another might whisper that they preferred a strong lord who could fix things with an iron hand. The threat of more conspiracies loomed, especially among those who dreamed of a return to the glorious old days of knights and lords. Old habits died hard, and across the sea lay potential enemies who might seek to exploit Westeros's new vulnerabilities. But for the first time in living memory, no noble house claimed dominion over the realm. No house banners flew above the ramparts of the Red Keep. The old families had lost their birthrights. Men and women who had once been powerless could now speak openly in assemblies. The Freedmen's Council, for all its flaws, tried to govern with transparency. Daenerys, though still the most powerful individual in Westeros, refrained from placing herself above the will of the councils. She recognized that if she did, she would undermine everything she had worked toward. Some nights, she walked alone by the scarred ruin of the throne room, the place where the melted iron throne stood as a bleak sculpture. She would run her hand along its twisted metal, remembering how she had fantasized once about sitting upon it, wearing a crown as all the realm bowed. Now she found it a relic, a cautionary tale. She had melted it in a moment of heartbreak and rage, but also with a deeper understanding that no single seat should hold absolute power over millions. In the flickering torchlight, she sometimes heard footsteps behind her. Often, it was Tyrion, offering a half-smile and a tired quip. Sometimes it was Grey Worm, silently standing guard, still loyal despite the dissolution of everything they once fought to achieve. And occasionally, she would find herself alone, confronted only by the silent reminder of what once was. In such solitude, she would reflect on the cost of this revolution. She pictured the faces of the civilians who died in the final siege. She remembered the betrayal in the eyes of those who had believed in the old monarchy. She thought of Jon Snow and how heartbreak had nearly driven him to kill her. She shuddered at the memory of how close she had come to becoming the very monster she despised. But looking now at the Freedmen's Charter, at the living experiment around her, she felt a kind of cautious hope. She had cracked the foundations of feudal power, shattered the illusions of a rightful house, a rightful family. She had unleashed chaos, yes, but from that chaos something new was being born. She could see it in the eyes of the laborers rebuilding the city. They did not toil for a lord's profit. They were paid fairly, and they had a voice in how their neighborhoods would be shaped. She saw it in the laughter of children who would grow up never calling anyone my lord or my lady, never imagining that they were lesser because of their birth. All around, the lords were gone, and in their place rose an uncertain yet living tapestry of voices, each one straining toward something resembling collective rule. It was messy, it was incomplete, but it was alive. And after so much death and despair, that was more than Daenerys had ever dared to hope. She closed her eyes in the emptiness of the throne room. Drogon's presence was somewhere above, perched on a tower or flying in the moonlight. She exhaled slowly, feeling the ghost of a smile at the corner of her lips, and allowed herself a single whisper that only the melted throne could hear. "I promise to break the wheel." And though the wheel had been shattered, The journey of building its replacement had only begun. Daenerys Targaryen, a name that once heralded conquest, now stood as the founder of a radically new order. Not an absolute queen, but a guiding presence, a mother of possibility. As the city slowly came back to life below her, as the Freedmen's Council found its footing, as the banners of old houses slipped into memory, the realm entered a new chapter where power was no longer inherited by blood, but entrusted by free choice. For all its tenuousness, for all its inevitable challenges, it was a Westeros unchained. And Daenerys, in the quiet glow of a new dawn, stood at the heart of it, neither crowned nor bowed, but simply determined to see it through. Weeks passed, and the Freedmen's Charter continued to take hold, spreading across the land through local assemblies and the promise, however tenuous, of a new life without lords or ladies. Still, in every corner of Westeros, old roots ran deep. Generations of tradition could not be undone in the span of a few months. Some accepted the changes with hesitant optimism, while others whispered of conspiracies or clung to past loyalties. Daenerys, determined to see her vision through, relied on her council and her own tireless efforts to hold this fragile realm together. She spent her days receiving delegates who arrived with questions about the new laws, how to handle disputes over inheritance when inheritance of titles was now void, how to resolve the fate of orphan children once wards of noble houses, whether a region like the Iron Islands was bound by the Freedmen's Charter if their local assembly threatened to break away. Each question seemed to reveal another layer of complexity. In the old system, a single king or queen would simply hand down an edict, or ignore the problem until it erupted into violence. Under the new system, solutions required negotiation, compromise, and constant oversight. Tyrion often joked that he would die buried under parchment. He spent late nights hunched over desks with clerks and scribes, drafting treaties, disclaimers, and clarifications for the Freedmen's Charter so that each corner of Westeros might implement it with as few misunderstandings as possible. He also oversaw financial matters, paying the Realm Guard, replenishing the City Watch, and funding public works. The limited coffers of the Old Crown, even supplemented by seized Lannister gold, often seemed precariously low. One cold morning, Tyrion found Daenerys in the once grand courtyard of the Red Keep where a modest sparring yard had been set up for the Realm Guard. The walls were still scorched and half-repaired, the ground muddy from overnight rain. Grey Worm directed a handful of new recruits in basic pike formations. The men wore simple gear, no heraldry, and their faces were set in grim concentration. Daenerys stood to one side with her arms folded across her chest, watching the drill. She wore no crown, only a dark cloak clasped at the neck. When Tyrion approached, she gave him a faint smile. "They're improving," she said quietly, gesturing to the recruits. "Many of them are former soldiers of the Lannisters, the Baratheons, the Tyrells. At least now they fight for something greater than a single lord's ambitions." Tyrion nodded. "A pity it took so many wars to get here. But yes, it's a relief to see them drilling side by side." He paused, then sighed, adjusting the collar of his doublet against the cool wind. "I bring news from the west. I'm afraid it's not good." Daenerys turned to him, her posture tensing. "The Westerlands?" "Yes." Tyrion drew in a breath. "Some of my distant cousins, minor Lannisters once tied to the main branch, have organized. They call themselves the Crimson Lion, presumably to differentiate from the Golden Lion standard that's now defunct. They've gathered a few hundred men in the hills near Ashmark. The Freedmen's Council in Lannisport sent word that these insurgents refuse to accept the charter. They're attacking small villages that pledge loyalty to the new councils." Daenerys's expression grew stormy. "They want to restore House Lannister?" Tyrion's mouth twisted wryly. "That seems to be their aim, though calling it a restoration is a farce. The main Lannister line is all but gone. Cersei is dead. Jaime is dead. Our father, well, we know what happened to him. I'm the last of the direct line, and I'm certainly not interested in reviving feudal rule. These cousins are opportunists. They see a chance to claim the old Lannister seat by force, counting on the local peasants' fear." She turned her gaze back to the sparring recruits. "And how many men do they have?" "Unclear," Tyrion said. The Freedmen's Council in Lannisport estimates at least 300 or 400, possibly more. Enough to terrify the region if they use bandit tactics. The local assemblies are rattled. They're calling on King's Landing for assistance, our new realm guard, specifically. Daenerys sighed, the weight of decision pressing upon her. Send a messenger to Grey Worm's Council of Captains. They'll dispatch a contingent to Lannisport and Ashmark. We can't let these rebels destabilize the West. But we do it carefully, Tyrion. Her eyes flicked to his. No overreach. We're not marching under a single banner to crush them in Dragonfire. The Realm Guard is there to protect the people, not conquer them again. He inclined his head. Agreed. The Freedmen's Charter is fragile enough. We must show we stand for order and protection, not tyranny. Then his eyes drifted to Grey Worm, who had begun to bark orders in a stern Essosi accent. He'll want to move decisively, of course. Daenerys nodded. I know. I can't blame him. The Unsullied always favored swift action. But we must not become the thing we overthrew. They fell silent for a moment, each recalling how close Daenerys had come to ruling by fear alone. Neither voiced it, but the memory hung in the air like the faint scent of ash that still lingered in certain corners of King's Landing. Later that day, Daenerys convened a brief meeting with Grey Worm and the Realm Guard captains, men and women chosen by the Freedmen's Council for their experience. Among them stood a grizzled ex-ranger from the Wall, a former Tyrell bannerman who'd lost faith in the old system, and a weathered Cellsail from the Stepstones who had turned over a new leaf in Westeros. Grey Worm, as the most disciplined soldier, was their unofficial leader, though not by royal command. The Freedmen's Council had voted him into that position, trusting his loyalty to Daenerys but also to the new laws. Within a small antechamber in the Red Keep, bare stone walls, a round table, and a scattering of maps, Daenerys explained the crisis in the Westerlands. Grey Worm's dark, unwavering eyes scanned the map. We will need enough men to break their hold and protect the villages, he said. A measured force, Daenerys replied. No scorched earth, no terror. A flicker of emotion crossed Grey Worm's features. Understood. We will do as the council directs. And so, within days, a company of 300 Realm Guard soldiers, marching under the simple gray field bearing the map of Westeros, departed King's Landing. They rode west along the Gold Road, determined to confront the Crimson Lion. Daenerys stayed behind, trusting in the Freedmen's Charter's process. In the old days, she might have flown Drogon overhead to strike fear into the rebels. Now, she wanted to see if the Realm Guard, answerable to the people, could handle the crisis without the hammer blow of a dragon. As the company departed, she felt a pang of anxiety. Would they succeed? Would this new concept of a people's defense hold up in the face of real resistance? She found herself pacing the Red Keep's corridors at odd hours, worrying that if the Realm Guard faltered, the entire Freedmen's Charter might unravel. Some part of her still itched to mount Drogon and personally see to it that no one threatened the freedom she had proclaimed. But she forced herself to trust in the system she was building. That was the entire point. In the weeks that followed, word trickled back in bits and pieces. Skirmishes near Ashmark. A handful of captured rebels. The Crimson Lion's tactics were brutal but disorganized. They raided farmland, burned barns, and stole livestock, hoping to undermine the Freedmen's Council's legitimacy. The Realm Guard responded, employing discipline and more advanced formations learned from the Unsullied. Slowly, the rebels were cornered. While all this transpired, the Freedmen's Council continued its day-to-day governance. Debates raged in the old throne room, still overshadowed by the melted husk of the Iron Throne, over taxes, trade routes, the North's concerns, and Dorne's wariness. Dorne, as ever, hovered on the edge of the realm, half inclined to fully secede. It was only the presence of a few enthusiastic Dornish delegates who believed that true independence might be best served by fostering a strong Freedmen's Charter that kept them engaged. Let the rest of Westeros tear itself apart again, some Dornishmen muttered. We can stand alone. But their delegates spoke forcefully of unity, pointing out that any breakaway attempt might provoke the very wars they all hoped to avoid. Occasionally, Daenerys saw Sansa Stark's Ravenborn letters posted among the Freedmen's Council archives. Sansa reported steady progress in the north. Winterfell no longer belonged to House Stark. It was used as a central gathering hall. The North's people were fiercely independent, but many younger voices liked the idea of shaping their own governance. Some older families, like the Manderleys or the Glovers, still clung to the memory of lordly privilege. Yet for the moment, Sansa's firm guidance, her skillful negotiation and her willingness to let the people speak, kept the North from boiling over in conflict. Jon, according to the rumor mill, spent time helping the free folk settle areas in the Gift. He quietly mediated between them and northern farmers, ensuring that disputes over grazing and hunting did not escalate. He did not seat himself in any throne-like position or claim any titles, but the Freedmen's Council recognized his efforts. They sent him official thanks in the form of messages. To Jon Snow of the North, for services rendered in peacekeeping. He never wrote back with more than a brief acknowledgement. He seemed content to remain on the periphery, forging a life unburdened by the nightmares of kingship or birthright. At last, news arrived that the Crimson Lion had been defeated. The Realm Guard's discipline and superior numbers, bolstered by local volunteers loyal to the Freedmen's Council in Lannisport, proved too much for the rebels. Some of the ringleaders were captured, while others scattered into the hills. A few died in battle. The captured ones were marched to Lannisport to face a tribunal composed of local representatives, Realm Guard officers, and neutral observers. When Daenerys received the report, she felt a cautious relief. Tyrion, on the other hand, showed a flicker of sadness. "They were my kin of a sort," he remarked to her as they walked through the Red Keep's newly planted garden. "But in truth, none of them held any love for me, nor I for them. The old House Lannister can't be resurrected by outlaws." Daenerys paused to regard a row of roses. Much of the garden had been replanted from seeds brought in from the Reach. "Are you all right, Tyrion? I know seeing your house's name used as a banner for violence can't be easy." He gave a small shrug. "I'm well enough. My family legacy was stained long before I was old enough to understand it. If anything, this cements my belief that we're doing the right thing. People who pine for the old ways aren't content to let the realm live in peace." He gently touched one of the roses, as if checking for thorns. "I only hope the Freedmen's Council does not become as corrupt as the old monarchy. Power has a way of twisting men. Women too, for that matter." She nodded, recalling how it had almost twisted her beyond redemption. "We have to remain vigilant." Some days after the Crimson Lion's defeat, the Freedmen's Council hosted a public hearing in King's Landing, both to celebrate the Realm Guard's victory and to highlight that trials for the captured rebels would be conducted fairly. A small group from Lannisport, including those tasked with judging the rebels, arrived in the city, escorted by a contingent of Realm Guard soldiers. They brought bound prisoners with them, along with wagons of evidence, weapons, stolen gold, and forged documents that claimed certain individuals had a right by blood to rule the Westerlands. The hearing took place in the old throne room. The melted iron throne, black and jagged, stood behind Daenerys and the Freedmen's Council as a permanent reminder of what they had destroyed. Lanterns and torches lit the space with a warm glow. On the floor, a large semicircle of seats was arranged for the council members, about 100 men and women representing the various regions, though not all had traveled here. Many local councils had chosen delegates to attend in their stead, as was now common practice. At the center of the semicircle stood a makeshift dock for the prisoners. They shuffled in, manacled, under guard. Some stared defiantly at the Freedmen's Council. Others drooped with fear or shame. Tyrion observed them from behind a low wooden lectern, and Daenerys stood nearby, watching quietly. She was not presiding like a queen. Instead, the representatives from Lannisport, along with judges the Freedmen's Council had sanctioned, would question the prisoners and determine the sentences. One of the accused was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dirty blonde hair and a snarl etched on his face. He called himself Martin Lannister, though Tyrion knew his actual lineage was distant, a mere cousin's cousin. During the hearing, Martin ranted about how Daenerys Targaryen had no right to strip houses of their titles, how it violated the natural order. He claimed the Crimson Lion only meant to restore true leadership to the Westerlands. A murmur rippled through the council at his words. Some scowled, others gazed at him with pity, and a few even seemed uncertain. Yet none rushed to defend him outright. The freedman's charter was clear. No more titles by birth, no more feudal claims. The majority of the realm had begun to accept that any attempt to resurrect the old system would lead to endless strife. The lead judge, a middle-aged woman named Elaine Rivers, herself born a bastard of the Trident region, calmly asked, "Martin Lannister, do you admit to leading armed raids on villages that recognize the Freedmen's Council?" He spat on the floor. "I do, and I'd do it again, if it would rid us of this tyranny." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "You call it tyranny, yet it is you who terrorized small folk, burned their homes, and stole their crops." Tyranny was the old way. A few families born to privilege, ruling without challenge. Martin seethed, but said nothing more. The other prisoners gave similar testimonies of misguided loyalty or raw ambition. Some insisted they were only following orders, or that they'd been tricked by propaganda claiming the Freedmen's Council was about to enslave everyone. Most of these men had already abandoned hope, seeing their leaders captured and their cause in ruins. Over the course of a week, the hearing proceeded. Evidence was presented, witnesses spoke, and the Freedmen's Council members asked questions. Daenerys stood off to the side, occasionally locking eyes with the accused. She saw in them the same blend of fear and rage that had once fueled so many lords and ladies across Westeros. The difference was that now, their claims held no legal weight. They did not have a great house behind them, only the phantom of a memory. In the end, most were sentenced to labor for the realm's rebuilding efforts, repairing roads and walls, felling timber, working under guard for a specified duration. A few ringleaders, including Martin Lannister, were sentenced to death for murder and torture committed during their raids. Once again, the Freedmen's Council wrestled with the morality of capital punishment but concluded that the worst atrocities demanded accountability. The hangings were carried out at dawn in King's Landing, in a courtyard that had seen too many executions over the centuries. This time, the watchers included delegates from all regions. No single king or queen gave the order. It came from the council. Daenerys did not attend, though she heard the hush of the crowd from her balcony, as if the city itself held its breath. She remembered the day she had arrived at King's Landing, full of fire and vengeance, and how different this moment felt. There was no triumphant roar, no horrifying spectacle of dragon flame. There was only the silence of a sober, collective judgment. When it was over, Tyrion found her alone in at same balcony, overlooking the city that stretched toward the sunrise. The new buildings, the scaffolding, and the crowds reminded them both how far King's Landing had come since the Day of Ashes. "It's done," Tyrion said quietly. "Martin is dead. So are his co-conspirators." Daenerys nodded, her face unreadable. "No one is cheering in the streets," she observed. "No," Tyrion agreed. "They've seen enough death. So have we." They fell into a reflective silence before Tyrion mustered the courage to add, "In another lifetime, he might have been the one wearing gold and red finery, invited to the royal feast, while the small folk bowed. Perhaps that was the only future he understood. I wonder how many more like him lurk in the shadows, waiting for their chance to bring back the old ways." Daenerys's gaze hardened. "We knew this would be a struggle. The Freedmen's Charter wasn't a magic spell that turned everyone righteous. We've simply opened a door. It's up to the realm to walk through it." She paused, letting out a long breath. "And up to us to keep that door from slamming shut." Tyrion nodded, a bittersweet smile on his lips. "Well, if nothing else, we can say we're living in interesting times. That winter turned out milder than most. The north still wore its usual cloak of snow, but King's Landing only saw a few flurries. The Freedmen's Council pressed on with reform after reform, some successful, some mired in controversy. A few bold communities in the Riverlands started experimenting with shared farmland, collectively owned. Others insisted on more private arrangements, selling and buying parcels of land freely. The Freedmen's Council tried to mediate or let local decisions stand. so long as no one exploited laborers or seized land by force. Overseeing it all from the capital was no easy task, but Daenerys gradually stepped back from direct involvement. She let the council sessions run without her constant presence, though they still sought her advice on external threats and on any matter involving dragons. Drogon had taken to roosting on a newly reinforced tower of the Red Keep, gliding over the city at night. The people had grown accustomed to his silhouette against the moon, though many still felt a trace of awe or fear at the sight. Daenerys, meanwhile, spent time traveling to different parts of Westeros, not as a conqueror but as an envoy of goodwill, and, in a sense, as a living symbol of the Freedmen's Charter. She visited the Riverlands, where she met the Freedmen's Council delegates and listened to local farmers speak of how the land once claimed by House Frye had been parceled out among those who had worked it for decades. Some farmland was kept communal, some sold at fair prices. It was a messy process, but the people seemed determined to make it work. She visited the Reach, where she was greeted by orchard owners and stewards, each eager to show off their region's bounty. With House Tyrell gone, small folk who once served at Highgarden were forming their own assemblies, deciding how to coordinate the harvest. She sampled their wines and heard their pleas for better protection against brigands roaming the roads. The Freedmen's Council had dispatched realm guard detachments there, too, but the region was vast. In the Vale, she was surprised to find a relatively calm situation. The mountainous terrain, once fiercely loyal to House Arryn, now looked to a council of knights and shepherds who seemed oddly proud to prove they could manage on their own. Young Robin Arryn was still alive, though he had no official title. He lingered in the Eyrie, overshadowed by a caretaker council. Some said he was content to let others handle governance, preferring hawking and feasting to endless debates. As long as the Vale remained peaceful, the Freedmen's Council saw no immediate cause to intervene. Daenerys did not travel to the north in person that winter, though she exchanged letters with Sansa. They kept their correspondence polite, if not warm. Sansa wrote of forging a new identity for Winterfell as a communal stronghold. She mentioned that some ex-lords in the north grumbled, but the common folk seemed to enjoy having a say in local affairs. "It remains an uneasy balance," Sansa wrote, "but we have endured worse. At least no foreign invader tries to subdue us now." Daenerys could practically hear Sansa's dry tone in the letter, but it no longer bristled with hostility. They both understood the fragile peace they maintained. At times, Daenerys wondered if Jon would return to King's Landing. She heard through the grapevine that he seldom left the upper north, dividing his time between the Gift and occasionally visiting Winterfell for certain gatherings. He seemed content to fade from the center of power. Whenever she felt a twinge of longing or regret, she reminded herself that they both carried too many scars. Perhaps distance was a mercy. The months rolled on. The Freedmen's Charter settled into the daily life of Westeros. The local assemblies gathered at intervals, sending their chosen delegates to King's Landing for Grand Council sessions. Corruption remained a concern. Some delegates were rumored to be bribed by wealthy merchants or old families with hidden gold. The Freedmen's Council formed an oversight committee, a group of men and women devoted to investigating allegations of bribery or abuse of power. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than the old realm had ever tried. Trade began to flourish with Essos as well. Braavos was intrigued by the Freedmen's Charter, though the Iron Bank remained cautious. Pentos and Volantis sent envoys curious about selling their wares to a Westeros no longer bound by fractious wars. Daenerys met with these envoys, speaking of fair trade and shared prosperity. Gone were the days when a single king or queen set the tariffs by fiat. Now, such matters were determined by the Freedmen's Council, which formed a subcommittee on foreign commerce. Sometimes it amused Daenerys to watch these subcommittees function. A blend of ex-knights, ex-merchants, literate smallfolk, and even a few bastards of noble birth, all crammed into a council chamber, heatedly debating import taxes on Myrish lace or the protocols for ships arriving in the harbors. She remembered the grand courts she had imagined as a girl, full of pomp and ceremony. The reality was far more chaotic and mundane, but it was real. All was not entirely peaceful, though. Rebels still stirred in out-of-the-way corners. The Crimson Lion had fallen, but new groups took on different names, trying to rally support for a true monarchy. Most were stamped out swiftly by the Realm Guard or by local militias, which often sided with the Freedmen's Charter out of self-interest. People were tired of war, and the charter at least promised a say in their own governance. One day, after returning to King's Landing from a trip to the Reach, Daenerys found a surprising visitor waiting for her at the Red Keep. It was Lord Gendry, no, not a lord anymore, just Gendry Waters or Gendry Baratheon by birth if one fancied the name. He stood in the courtyard with his hammer slung over his shoulder. She remembered raising him to Lord of Storm's End before the final battle against the dead. But that lordship no longer existed. The Freedmen's Charter had abolished it. When she approached, he lowered his head, not in a bow exactly, but in a respectful tilt. I hope I'm not intruding." She offered a courteous smile. "Not at all. It's good to see you, Gendry. I didn't realize you were in the city." He shifted his hammer a bit awkward. "I've been in the Stormlands most of the time working. We started a local assembly there. I sit on it sometimes, but I'm more useful in the forge, making tools and weapons." He gave a small chuckle. "Funny, isn't it? I was named a lord for about 5 minutes, and now, well, I'm just me again." Daenerys studied his face. He had matured a bit, bearing a light stubble and the lines of a man who toiled in the sun. Yet he still had that earnest glint in his eye. "Do you resent me for taking back what I once gave you?" He blinked, clearly having mulled that over. "I won't pretend I didn't like the idea of being somebody. But the Freedmen's Council in the Stormlands needed smiths more than lords. And me, I reckon I'm happier swinging a hammer than signing decrees. So no, I don't resent you. The world's changed, but I'm trying to help shape it." She inclined her head. "I'm glad you came. Will you join us at the council session tomorrow? The Stormlands deserve representation." Gendry nodded. I plan to." Then a hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "You know, I never imagined I'd be sitting at a table with fisherfolk, innkeepers, and merchant captains, all deciding how Storm's End, that is, the fortress formerly called Storm's End, should be used. We're turning part of it into a storage depot for grain, part into a communal lodging for families who lost their homes in the wars. We're even opening the old Baratheon tombs for public view. Some folks like to pay respects to the old lords, but it's more a historical curiosity now." She felt a faint pang at the mention of tombs, recalling her own family's legacy. A line of Targaryens, their tombs scattered across Dragonstone and beyond. "Times truly have changed," she murmured, "and I hope for the better." Before he left, Gendry mentioned that he'd heard rumors of a new rebellion stirring around Storm's End. Small, disorganized, but worrisome. A group calling themselves the Warhounds, claiming lineage from old Baratheon bannermen. They were rumored to be recruiting among disaffected soldiers. Gendry had tried to talk them down, reminding them that the Freedmen's Charter granted them a voice, but they refused to listen. Daenerys thanked him for the warning. She immediately sent word to the Realm Guard captains, urging them to keep a careful watch around the Stormlands. Another flicker of anxiety rose in her. The Freedmen's Charter, for all its promise, seemed perpetually under threat from those clinging to old glories. Yet she reminded herself that she had not expected it to be easy. A few evenings later, Daenerys found herself in the Red Keep's old library, rummaging through scrolls by candlelight. Much of the library had burned or been looted during the sack, but some tomes had survived in hidden alcoves. Tyrion had taken it upon himself to rescue what he could. She was searching for references to how the free cities across the narrow sea governed themselves, hoping to glean ideas for the Freedmen's Council. She found mentions of Braavos' Sea Lord elections, Volantis' Triarchs, the merchant princes of Pentos. All were flawed systems in their own right, yet they showed that monarchy was not the only path. Lost in study, she nearly jumped when a soft voice spoke behind her. "You're burning the midnight oil as well, I see." She turned to find Davos Seaworth standing in the doorway, a gentle smile on his weathered face. He stepped inside, his limp more noticeable in the hush of the library. "Apologies. I didn't mean to startle you. You're Daenerys." He caught himself, remembering that titles were no longer in favor. She smiled back. It's all right, Davos. You can call me by name, or whatever you like. Titles aren't something I cling to anymore. He gave a faint chuckle. Old habits die hard. I was used to calling everyone my lord, or my lady, for so long, being a smuggler who preferred not to get his head chopped off. He glanced at the pile of scrolls on the desk. Doing some light reading? She gestured wearily. Yes, looking at examples of different governance structures in Essos, trying to see what worked, what failed. Trying to find a path for Westeros that avoids the pitfalls. Davos nodded, stepping closer. He picked up one of the scrolls, scanning a fragment discussing the elections of Bravos. I spent time in Bravos once. The city is proud and wealthy, but far from a utopia. Corruption seeps in easily. The wealthy families wield more power than the poorest. Some might argue that's inevitable. Daenerys's lips thinned. Nothing's inevitable. Not if we fight against it. The Freedmen's Charter can't solve everything, but if we give up trying to root out corruption, we might as well crown a new king right now. Davos set the scroll down. Well, you've done something I never dreamed possible. If my old friend Stannis could see all this. He caught himself, a pained memory in his eyes. He believed in the rule of law. Perhaps he'd have admired the charter. Or perhaps he'd have called it heresy. Hard to say. Daenerys noticed his sorrow. She rested a hand lightly on his arm. We can't change the past, Davos. We can only steer the future. And I'm grateful you've stayed by my side. Even after all that happened. He shrugged gently. I saw you save the world from the dead. I saw you free thousands. I also saw you burn King's Landing. My heart was torn that day, but I believed you had the will to make amends, to build something better. As long as I see you leading by example, I'll offer what help I can. She nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and remorse. The memory of the city aflame still haunted her. She turned back to the scrolls, her voice growing quiet. I'll keep leading by example then. Davos gave a small nod and patted her shoulder. Mind you get some rest, though. A leader who never sleeps can't think straight. Then, with a wry smile, he ambled out of the library, leaving her with her thoughts. The seasons crept onward, and with them came a cautious sense of normalcy. The Freedmen's Council was no longer a novelty but rather the accepted means of governance. Each region, each cluster of towns, managed its local affairs through assemblies, which sent delegates to the Grand Council in King's Landing on rotating schedules. The city itself, once half-ruined, had seen a boom in construction. New stone buildings rose amid older, repaired structures. Public squares were laid out, with communal wells and markets that bustled with trade. Daenerys made a habit of walking among the people, sometimes with only a handful of guards, sometimes alone, though Grey Worm despised the latter. She wanted to see firsthand if the Freedmen's Charter truly made a difference. She encountered vendors who grinned and offered her fresh-baked bread in thanks for the rebuilding programs. She also found beggars and refugees who drifted in from the countryside, hoping for a chance to petition the council or find work. Not all found success. Even in a freed realm, poverty and hardship could not vanish overnight. She attended an open assembly in a newly built forum just outside the old city walls, formerly a barren field littered with scorched debris. Now it was an airy plaza with rows of stone benches. A few local matters were being discussed. How to handle stray animals roaming the streets, where to build an additional granary, how to assist a village that had suffered a fire. Ordinary concerns, small in scale, but somehow precious in their normalcy after years of war. Standing on the sidelines, she listened as a leatherworker, a fishmonger, and a former soldier debated the best location for the granary. Each spoke passionately, no one deferring to a higher lord. Eventually, they arrived at a consensus to build near the Rosby Gate, where wagons could pass easily to the harbor. Daenerys found herself smiling, thinking, this is what we fought for, people deciding their own fates, free of crowns and swords hanging over their heads. But always there were reminders that the fight was not over. The warhounds in the Stormlands had clashed twice with the Realm Guard, leading to bloody skirmishes. The Freedmen's Council dispatched reinforcements, and Gendry wrote to Daenerys about the chaos. "They're a small group, but vicious," he wrote. "They keep claiming the Stormlands belongs to the true Baratheon line. It seems that's me, ironically, but I want no part of their cause. They're well funded by some unknown source. I suspect ex-mercenaries or smugglers. We'll try to root them out." Over in the Iron Islands, Yara Greyjoy managed to keep a tentative peace, though some Ironborn yearned for the old reaving ways. She imposed harsh penalties on those who tried to raid Westerosi coasts, occasionally clashing with them at sea. But no all-out war had erupted. The Freedmen's Charter in the Iron Islands was smaller and more loosely organized. Daenerys considered traveling there to show support but was advised to wait until Yara herself invited her. From the north came more letters from Sansa. She described the slow but steady adaptation to the Freedmen's Charter. Some northern families, like the Mormonts, wholeheartedly embraced the new order, feeling that it gave them more say in broader affairs. Others, like the Umbers, were skeptical. But no large-scale rebellion brewed there. The old feudal boundaries had blurred, and while some missed the name Stark, they also acknowledged the cruelty of kneeling to distant kings. Amid these shifts, Daenerys frequently found herself in deep conversations with Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, and the council delegates. They discussed everything from how to stabilize the currency. Westeros now minted coins bearing a new symbol, a stylized outline of the continent, to how to handle far-flung trade routes. Through it all, Daenerys insisted the Freedmen's Council remain open to public scrutiny, even though this occasionally led to heated protests. At least the realm was no longer strangled by secrecy and the manipulations of a single family. Though each day brought a litany of mundane challenges, each day also made the Freedmen's Charter more real. People began referring to it simply as the Charter or the Council, speaking of it as a living institution rather than an experiment. Children who had never known a crowned king grew up in an era where they learned reading and writing through community programs funded by the council. Some would one day ask their grandparents, "Was it true that people used to kneel to a single ruler? How strange." One such child, a clever little girl of perhaps 10, approached Daenerys in a market square, recognized her silver hair and the scarlet and black cloak she sometimes wore, and blurted, "Are you the Dragon Queen?" Daenerys knelt to speak at eye level, smiling kindly. "I'm Daenerys. No queen, though. Not anymore. But you have a dragon, right?" The girl pressed, wide-eyed. "My uncle says you once sat on a big throne and had an army." Daenerys nodded. "Once I did have a throne and an army. But that was before we broke the wheel, before the Freedmen's Charter. Now no one sits on a throne. We all stand together." The girl looked puzzled, glancing around as if searching for a queenly retinue. "So, you're not in charge of everyone?" Daenerys gave a gentle laugh. "No, we're all in charge. That's the idea. Maybe one day, you'll represent your neighborhood at the council, if that's what you want." The little girl's eyes lit up, but she shook her head quickly. "I want to see the dragon. Can I ride it?" Daenerys chuckled again. "He's a bit too big for that, I'm afraid, and a bit too proud. But if you're brave, you might catch a glimpse of him flying over the city at sunset." The girl grinned and dashed away, calling out to a friend about seeing the dragon. Daenerys rose, a soft warmth in her chest. For all the blood that had been spilled, for all the horrors of the past, here was a child who didn't fear an all-powerful monarch, only the wonder of a dragon. Perhaps that wonder could be harnessed for something better than conquest. Yet even as these peaceful vignettes played out, trouble brewed again in the Stormlands. A larger confrontation with the Warhounds erupted near a coastal fishing village. Gendry's letter arrived by Raven to the Red Keep, detailing how the rebel group had ambushed a realm guard patrol. Lives were lost on both sides. The Warhounds left messages scrawled in blood on walls. "A storm king shall rise," referencing ancient Baratheon legends. They threatened to march on the site of Storm's End, though that old fortress was largely unoccupied except for a caretaker assembly managing stores. The Freedmen's Council convened an emergency session. Delegates from the Stormlands demanded a strong response, while others worried about repeating the errors of the past, sending large armies, devastating the countryside. Tyrion, Davos, and Grey Worm debated how many troops to send. Daenerys listened, arms folded, recalling the fiasco in the Westerlands with the Crimson Lion. At length, Grey Worm spoke. "We must secure the region. The warhounds kill innocents. They want to overthrow the charter. If we do not act quickly, they'll spread fear and gain more recruits." Davos, seated nearby, nodded solemnly. "I agree, but we need to coordinate with local assemblies so we don't appear as invaders. Let them request and guide our forces." Daenerys weighed their words. "We should dispatch a force larger than before. These warhounds won't yield unless they see we can protect the people. But ensure we work with Gendry or any local councils. They must see us as partners, not a foreign legion." The council voted in favor of sending a contingent of 500 Realm Guard soldiers, supplemented by local volunteers. Tyrion arranged the funding and logistics. Before they departed, Grey Worm asked Daenerys a direct question. "Will you come with us this time? Let them see the breaker of chains stand against them." She hesitated. Part of her longed to show the warhounds the might of a dragon, to remind them that the days of petty tyrants were over. But she also knew her presence might revive old fears, that she would unleash Drogon to burn entire towns as she had once done in a moment of fury. She looked into Grey Worm's eyes and said, "No, I'll stay here. You have your orders. Fight if you must, but show them we are not conquerors. We are protectors." Grey Worm inclined his head. "Understood." Within days, the Realm Guard marched south, accompanied by supply wagons and recruits from King's Landing. Gendry awaited them in the Stormlands, leading a small local militia. He no longer carried any fancy title, just the respect of those who knew him to be a skilled blacksmith and a staunch defender of the charter. Letters streamed back to the capital, updating the Freedmen's Council on the conflict. The warhounds attacked in quick raids and vanished into the thick forests or along rocky shores. They tried to cast themselves as heroes, calling for a restoration of Storm King rule. But the local fishermen and farmers largely rebuked them, seeing only the violence of outlaws. Eventually, word arrived that the Realm Guard had cornered the warhounds near a fortress ruin on the coast, an ancient tower battered by centuries of storms. Pitched battle ensued. Dozens died, but the warhounds were routed. Their leader, a self-styled Storm Prince, claiming to be a bastard cousin of Robert Baratheon, was killed in the fighting. The fortress ruin was taken, and the Realm Guard established a temporary garrison. Once more, prisoners were marched to face a tribunal. A handful escaped, melting away into the wilderness, but their cause collapsed. Gendry wrote in his next letter that the Stormlands Assembly planned to demolish the fortress ruin to prevent further rebels from using it. "The people are tired of these self-proclaimed kings," he wrote. "They'd rather have safe roads, fair prices, and their children fed." Daenerys read this letter in the early morning light, standing by a window that overlooked the city. She felt relief at the warhounds' defeat. Yet she also felt the old stirrings of guilt. She recalled how much death she had seen, both inflicted and endured. Each new rebellion, each new band of outlaws, forced the Freedmen's Council to respond with armed force. Was she trapped in a cycle of violence, no matter how just the cause? Tyrion found her there, letter in hand. She shared its contents with him, and he offered a reassuring nod. "The charter is holding. The Realm Guard is doing what it was meant to do, protect, not oppress. And each time these rebels fail, fewer will rally to the next group waving the banner of a lost past." She set the letter aside. "Let's hope so. I never wanted to soak this land in blood again." He sighed. "The wheel was huge, Daenerys. We broke it, but pieces remain. They'll keep rolling around until we've proven beyond doubt that a free realm can stand on its own." She eyed him, her gaze softening. "Thank you for staying with me, Tyrion. I know I've said it before, but I'm not sure I'd have the strength to do this alone." He gave a tiny bow of his head. "You did once call me the Hand of the Queen, even if that role no longer formally exists. Perhaps I'm the Hand of the people now." She smiled. "That might suit you even better." 3 years passed in this manner. 3 years of skirmishes, debates, rebuilding, and cautious hope. The Freedmen's Charter matured into a functioning government. Not without flaws, not without corruption or lingering resentments, but far more equitable than any feudal monarchy Westeros had known. Roads linked distant towns, trade routes buzzed, farmland was redistributed in many regions, and the Realm Guard maintained a steady presence to keep bandits and rebels at bay. In King's Landing, the skyline changed with new towers, new public spaces, and fewer golden lions or crowned stag banners, now replaced by the council's simple sigil or by no sigil at all. The City Watch had been fully integrated into the new system, wearing plain cloaks dyed gray or brown instead of the old gold. The bright Lannister red was a memory. So was the Targaryen sigil, save for a few small decorations Daenerys kept in her personal chambers as family mementos. Drogon continued to roam, hunting in the fields beyond the city, sometimes disappearing for weeks to roost in the mountains. No one dared provoke him. He became an almost mythic guardian, a symbol of both fear and freedom. Whenever he soared over King's Landing, people stopped to watch in awe, children pointing with delight. He did not scorch farmland or threaten villages. Daenerys had trained him to avoid such destruction unless commanded, and she never commanded it. His presence alone was enough to deter foreign invasion or large-scale rebellion. Across the sea, Essos took note of Westeros's evolving government. Some free cities sent delegations to study the charter. They wanted to see if the stories were true, that Westeros had no king, no queen, and yet still functioned. Some speculated that this arrangement would collapse as soon as Daenerys Targaryen died or withdrew her support. But for now, the Freedmen's Charter continued. Within the realm, younger generations grew up without the assumption that lords or ladies were inherently superior. Local assemblies were filled with smiths, tailors, farmers, fisherfolk, and stonemasons, each discussing policies that affected their communities. Former highborn families often blended in, some gracefully, others grudgingly, losing their privilege but still able to contribute. A few holdouts nursed their bitterness in private, waiting for a chance to reclaim what they saw as rightfully theirs. But each passing year made it harder to argue that blood should rule. Daenerys herself lived in the Red Keep, though she did not occupy the grandest chambers or sit upon any throne. She took a set of modest rooms that overlooked the city, filling them with minimal adornments. Missandei's old room was left empty, carefully preserved as a memorial to her dear friend. Some nights, Daenerys roamed the corridors alone, recalling the ghosts of those who had died: Yora, Barristan, Rhaegal, Viserion, even the enemies whose fates had shaped her path. She carried these memories like a burden, but also as a reminder of the cost of power. On the 3rd anniversary of the Freedmen's Charter, a grand assembly was held in King's Landing. Delegates from every region attended. Even the North sent a sizable delegation, led by Sansa Stark. Though she did not claim any title, she remained a revered figure among the Northerners. Yara Greyjoy arrived from the Iron Islands, complaining about the length of the sea voyage but grumbling less than she once had. Dorne's contingent, resplendent in colorful silks, joined as well. The Great Hall, no longer referred to as the Throne Room, was filled with voices, banners of the Freedmen's Council, and the ever-present melted ruin of the Iron Throne at the rear. Daenerys stood at the center with Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, and a representative group of Realm Guard captains. The delegates settled into their semicircle of seats. Some 400 people filled the hall. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement, as well as a measure of solemn pride. For all the realm's hardships, this was a moment of validation. 3 years of relative stability under a system no one had believed possible. Sansa addressed the assembly first, her voice carrying the poise she'd honed over years of navigating politics. We stand here to mark 3 years since the Freedmen's Charter was ratified. The North, for one, can attest that while it has not been easy, it has been fairer than the old system of kneeling to distant crowns. Our people have a voice. That is worth preserving. A smattering of applause rose. Then Yara Greyjoy spoke, arms folded. I'm no great lover of councils and charters, but I prefer this to kneeling before some pompous fool in King's Landing. We Ironborn chart our own course within this new order, and that suits us. So yes, we remain, albeit with some grumbling. The delegates laughed softly. Others stood to share their perspectives. Representatives from the Riverlands praising the new farmland policies. From the Reach speaking of record harvests. From the Westerlands recounting how they'd finally stamped out the last embers of the Crimson Lion rebels. The Vale's delegates reported tranquility in their mountains, thanks to the end of the endless petty squabbles for ladyship. Dorne's delegates voiced their continuing independence of spirit, yet acknowledged the benefits of realm-wide trade and shared roads. Daenerys listened, her heart swelling. She thought of the day she had arrived with Drogon perched over a battered King's Landing, how she had forced a surrender drenched in fire and fear. Could she have imagined that, 3 years later, the people of Westeros would be openly debating policies, forging alliances, and celebrating a power structure built on collective will? The road ahead was still long, but this gathering felt like a milestone. Finally, Tyrion signaled her to speak. The hall quieted as she stepped forward, clad in a simple gray gown. She looked over the crowd. Lords turned commoners, commoners turned delegates, warriors turned peacekeepers. The ghosts of her past flickered at the edges of her vision. She took a breath. I stand before you not as a queen, nor as the scion of an ancient house. I stand before you as Daenerys, a woman who once believed she was destined to rule. I was wrong about that. No one is destined to rule. Power belongs to the people of this land, and the Freedmen's Charter is proof that you have seized that power for yourselves. 3 years ago, we shattered the Iron Throne. In its place, we built something fragile, something new, something that many doubted could survive. Yet here we are, still standing, still striving to improve. We've weathered rebellions, conspiracies, and old grudges. We will likely face more challenges. But if we hold true to the principle that no one is born with a right to dominate another, if we choose to govern ourselves with justice and compassion, then this realm will endure. I cannot erase the horrors of the past. I know my own hands are stained with blood. I know many of you bear scars from war and loss. But together, we can ensure that future generations inherit a land where peace and equality are not dreams but reality. We've accomplished what the old kings and queens never managed. A realm that answers to its people, not to a single ruler or an iron chair. May we continue on this path, despite the hardships. May we never again raise a sword in the name of blind feudal loyalty. May we honor each other's freedom. I pledge myself to the Freedmen's Charter, to stand beside you as an equal, to guide where I'm asked, and to serve where I'm needed. This is our home. This is our realm. Let it belong to all of us. She finished, and the hall erupted in applause. Some standing, some cheering, others wiping away tears. Not everyone agreed on every policy, but in that moment, they shared a sense of unity. Tyrion shot Daenerys a nod of approval. Sansa, too, gave the faintest smile, a spark of respect in her eyes. Daenerys stepped back into the semicircle, letting the Freedmen's Council resume its business. They had come a long way and still had miles more to go. Yet the wheel was broken. In its place was an uncertain but living tapestry of voices, forging destiny in common. The realm would never be the same, and that, at last, felt like hope rather than doom. The session stretched into the evening with discussions of trade pacts, guard rotations, and the need for more local schools. But Daenerys, though she listened attentively, felt a deeper calm blossoming. She had no crown, no throne, no absolute power, and that was the greatest victory she could imagine. When the assembly adjourned for the day, she walked through the hall, passing the melted Iron Throne. She paused to lay a hand on its twisted metal, remembering the moment Drogon's fire had claimed it. Ashen shadow, then molten steel. A single act of destruction that paved the way for something fragile but infinitely more hopeful. She heard Tyrion approach behind her. He said nothing, merely stood at her side, both gazing at the ruined throne. After a moment, Daenerys turned away, leaving the twisted metal behind in the flickering torchlight. She walked forward, toward the open doors of the hall where the delegates departed, talking and laughing, some of them perhaps disagreeing passionately about the future, but none of them bound by a single name or sigil. That was the new Westeros. unshackled from noble titles, free from feudal lords, its future in many hands rather than one. The journey had been painful and bloody, but the realm at last stood on a threshold of possibility. Daenerys Targaryen stepped through the doors, out into the courtyard, where the evening sky glowed with the last light of day. High above, Drogon soared in lazy circles. She lifted her eyes, watching him glide, an ancient power set free. A whisper of wind tugged at her hair. In the distance, she could hear the mingled voices of the council delegates. Some excited, some weary, all alive with the knowledge that they held their own fate. A smile curved her lips, soft and resolute. This was the world she had chosen to create. Not a perfect one, not a peaceful one every day, but one that belonged to everyone, where no child was born in chains, and no throne loomed to crush them all beneath its weight. This was the dream made real, and though it demanded constant vigilance, it was worth every sacrifice to uphold. She let the moment wash over her, then walked on, into a tomorrow unshackled by the ghosts of monarchy. The wind caught her cloak. The sun slipped below the horizon, and in that fading light, the mother of dragons, no longer a queen, continued to shepherd a realm into its uncertain, hopeful dawn.